everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the new year and the first monthly Beyond Zero Emissions discussion group for the year. We would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We'd like to thank the University of Melbourne Energy Research Institute, our Zero Carbon Australia partners, for this great venue. And we'll just start off for a few minutes. Tim Forsey is going to say a few words about the Energy Research Institute. Thanks, Tim.
Yes, I'm Tim Forsey, Energy Advisor at the University of Melbourne Energy Institute. But before I get into that, maybe I'll put my other hat on as a PZE volunteer, and it's good to see the discussion group going into 2015. I think I remember the beginning of the discussion group was about 2008, and there might have been about 10 of us in Mark Oak's art studio talking about sustainable transport. So it's good to see the discussion group looking pretty lively and going on into 2015. The University of Melbourne's had a relationship with Beyond Zero Emissions dating back to the Stationary Energy Plan, and then there was collaboration with the Buildings Plan and the high-speed rail, etc. So that's been a really good relationship. And of course, we've got the room available here for the discussion group. So that continues, and I'd really like to say that University of Melbourne and Beyond Zero, it's great to have that relationship. And then more specifically, recently, just the other day, we published this bit of work on the conversation, which is looking at the future of gas in New South Wales. And I actually had the opportunity to testify before the New South Wales Upper House last week about the future for gas demand in New South Wales and how it, instead of the forecast, which the official forecast, which is business as usual, continuous growth of gas, that's what they used to say about electricity. Of course, it didn't happen. And so the work we did looked at where gas might be going in terms of its use in electricity generation in New South Wales, and how it's used in industry, but also how it's used in buildings. And so you'll hear a lot more about the options that are available in buildings, gas versus electricity, that our main speaker, Craig, will be talking about. But in this report that we did, and I certainly invite you to have a look at the conversation and that article and the paper we produced, we referred to the Beyond Zero Buildings Plan, and I got some help from Richard Keach in trying to come up with some numbers for New South Wales as to exactly how much gas they use for hot water heating and for home heating, that sort of thing. So that's in there, but we also rely very strongly on the work that you're going to hear from Craig tonight from the ATA, which is just simply groundbreaking, where they've kind of taken some of the concepts of the buildings plan, I think, and gone to another level in terms of actually looking at the costs involved with different options. So welcome to Melbourne Uni tonight.
Where do you find this article on Lit?
Search for The Conversation and Tim Forsey. You'll find it.
The Conversation?
The Conversation.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim. I'd just like to make a couple of acknowledgements. Floating around somewhere, not in the room at the moment, is Miwa in the BZD t-shirt, who puts these discussion groups together. And she does a fantastic job. She finds the speakers and organises the night. And up back there up the back there is Roger Vise, who tapes the sessions and gets them up on the internet, so you can see them if you miss them. And down the front here we have Stephen, our CEO at BZD, who's also going to say a few words. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Hugh. Look, I won't take much time, but I just want to say what a great opportunity it is to have Craig here from the ATA. I meet with Donald Luckman, the CEO of the ATA, every few months for lunch, and we catch up every now and again. And it's great to have Craig here tonight, so welcome, Craig. And as Tim's mentioned, it's also great that we've got such a strong no gas message coming through the conversation article, through the work that Craig's done, but also through the work that BZD's been doing. You're pretty aware of the Energy Freedom Initiative. If you haven't joined Energy Freedom yet, please do so. The aim is to build a groundswell of householders who are taking action in their homes, also with the intent of taking action in their homes. That will place political pressure. The more households we have signing on to Energy Freedom, I can go to politicians and I can say, we have thousands of households who are signed up to Energy Freedom, and you better listen to us on this no gas message, because it is a very important one. It's going to become more important, and we'll hear more from that from Craig in this presentation tonight. So welcome, Craig, and I'll hand back to you.
Yes, thank you. So what an amazing organisation the Alternative Technology Association is. It started in 1980 and its mission was not just alternative technology, really, but sustainable technology. and it's certainly had an enormous contribution to sustainability in Victoria, in Australia. So tonight we're covering one of our favourite subjects, switching from gas to electric. And we have Craig Memery, energy specialist and consumer advocate at the Alternative Technology Association. He's going to present findings on their new project, Are We Still Cooking with Gas? Many households in Australia would be better off switching from gas to efficient electric appliances for both financial and environmental reasons. The report found that the combination of increasing gas prices and improving electric appliance efficiency is making electricity a cheaper option for many traditionally gas-fuelled energy needs, including space heating, water heating and cooking. Efficient electric appliances include heat pump hot water systems, induction cooktops and split-system reverse cycle air conditioners. The analysis is the first piece of detailed research that considers the impact of future gas prices on residential households in Australia. Would you please welcome Craig Memery?
Thanks very much. Well, I've been directed to wear a microphone recording device, and there's another, this one's not amplifying though, but there's another one apparently which if I'm mumbling too much I can wear separately. So if I'm mumbling too much, just yell out "what" or something. Hi, my name's Craig Memery. I'm with the Alternative Technology Association, as we've just heard. I'm also just back from 5 weeks on leave, so I've kind of, lost about 20 IQ points by relaxing too much. And it's probably slowed me down a bit, which is probably quite appropriate because the presentation I'll give you tonight is adapted from a presentation I squeezed into 10 minutes on another occasion. There's no chance I could squeeze it into 10 minutes now in my current relaxed mind state, so it should squeeze out, it should pad out nicely for as long as I've got. Please offer any questions or comments as we go. I'm just trying to work out how to put this thing in presenter mode.
Down the bottom top slide.
Bottom, top. I'll take the piece.
F5.
F5. Hey, that sounds easy. Oh yeah, cool. All right, first slide. At this rate, we might be done tonight. So, you heard a little bit about ATA. Yeah, we're a not-for-profit. We've been around for quite a while. We're a member-based organisation. We've got about 5,500 members, so we're generally householders, individuals who have got an interest in sustainable living. My role with ATA is I've got two roles: energy consumer advocate. I'm funded by the Consumer Advocacy Panel to represent all Australian energy users in respect to energy market reform, and also on a project-by-project basis for our grant makers and some of our commercial clients. I provide advice on different energy-related stuff, energy markets, energy policy and technology. So we've been looking at the gas problem, or I'll broadly call it a problem, for a while, and sort of considering what can we add to the discussion that's already occurring. BZE have been doing really good work looking at the environmental impacts of gas, and we've been pondering the economic aspects of it for some time and looking for good information to try and understand where gas is going in relation to costs, and in Australia in particular we couldn't find any. So as part of our background, we could see that gas prices have actually gone up by quite a lot, but no one noticed because we're all paying attention to electricity prices. These are the forecasts for gas prices over the next few years. Now, the different colours represent different bodies doing the forecasts at different times. These are older forecasts from 2011 and 2012. One thing that's consistent between them is that nothing is really consistent between them. They're kind of all over the shop. And that reflects that there's a great deal of uncertainty about the factors that are going to affect the price of gas going in the future. The main overarching factor is that we've got a gas export market opening up, which means that the gas that we've always bought cheaply domestically won't be available at that price. Domestic consumers will now have to compete with the international market, which pays a lot more for gas. So what's known is that the price will probably go up, and what's unknown is by how much. There's been some pretty high forecasts, as you can see, that suggest more than a tripling of the wholesale price of gas, which could lead to a more than 50% increase in the retail cost of gas that we pay for at our meters. Some other forecasts suggest it might sort of peter out. A lot of the more recent discussion, looking at the status of the gas market now and where the gas trains that are being opened are at and where supply is at and contracts are at, lean towards a rapid increase in gas price over the next few years, potentially followed by either a bursting bubble, basically, where prices plummet, or a longer decline. So since the time these forecasts have been produced, a lot of the forecasts are sort of settling into a common sort of range. They're still all over the shop though. What's certain is that prices will be going up. What's uncertain is what they'll do in the longer term after that few years. So at the same time as prices have gone up, all of these things that you can use to do the stuff we do with gas using electricity have become a lot more affordable and a lot more reliable and a lot more available. So we've got split system air conditioners, which are now very cheap, and they can do heating quite efficiently. Heat pumps for hot water have, until more recent years, they've been available, but some of them haven't been so reliable. There's been performance issues. The availability and reliability of some of the better performing models has improved a lot in more recent years. And induction cooktops have become, they've gone from being a niche item to being something that's commonly available, and so there's some quite cheap options available there. Like I say, if you've got any questions, just yell out along the way. If there's any technology that I refer to that's not self-explanatory or you're not already aware of, feel free to yell out. So we got to this point of thinking, well, what's the best option for householders using gas or electric for a lot of those items? We found that there was nothing that was up to date that really considered all of those factors, future gas prices increasing and the recent improvements to performance. So we got some funding from the Consumer Advocacy Panel to go and answer that question ourselves. We've got a highly skilled modelling team who work with us, and so we undertake some very, very detailed economic modelling, as well as some research to gather a lot of background information and drawing on some of the great information that was out there, including some of the work by BZE, which I'll touch on later. And really what we were trying to understand was just the price. We were trying to separate out, we all know about the environmental issues to a large extent. We wanted to be able to contribute to the debate something that energy policy makers would listen to, not dismiss as environmental hippie stuff, and actually hear out in terms of the price impacts of gas and the decisions that people make about fuel choices in their homes. Because let's face it, the unfortunate reality is there's a lot of people out there, a lot of decision makers and policy makers couldn't give a rat's about the environmental impact. So if there's a story that we can tell in relation to price that leads to a similar outcome, then great. And look, if we get a different outcome that says that gas is still a wonderful thing, then we just bury the report and don't tell anyone. I shouldn't say that. We do pride ourselves on our independence, and we maintain it, and as you'll see by our interpretation of the results, where we say that gas isn't always the most cost-effective option. Electricity isn't always the most cost-effective option. So, because we're geeks and really pedantic, we considered a lot of things in producing this report. We wanted something that was robust, that was going to survive the inevitable scrutiny that it would be placed under, and from all the feedback that we've had, it sounds like it does that pretty well. We made some assumptions and some considerations, and look, here's just a real snapshot of some of the key ones. Firstly, we considered, it was in the context of households, residential setting, so we considered it was important that we consider like-for-like substitution. Now, in some areas that's easy. Things that provide hot water. You really don't care about a lot to do with the quality of the thing that provides you with hot water, as long as you get consistent hot water out of it. Cooking's a very different story, though. We assumed that you wouldn't ever conscionably replace an electric resistance, use an electric resistance-based cooktop to replace a gas cooktop. You'd be mad, because cooking with gas is much easier. Cooking with electric resistance is relatively unsafe and boring and takes a long time to heat up and so on. We consider, though, that electric induction, which is different to gas in a lot of ways, can be considered like for like, because in terms of its overall amenity, it's at least as friendly to use. It's got some safety benefits and so on. We considered different household types. Now, this was a very challenging area. We're obviously doing some really broad modelling, and we didn't have the opportunity to consider every one of the possible 1,000 configurations of households. So we narrowed it down to about 6. We took a base model sort of household that was somewhere in between, an average house. We used that, referenced that up and down to consider a small house and a large house. And then we've got a strong social focus with all the work that we do. So we considered a house that represented at least a Victorian public housing type house. So housing that's provided to people on low incomes, and we considered a lot of the specific elements around that. That's quite relevant for a few reasons, some of which I'll touch on if we've got time. We considered houses that were on LPG, bottled gas, rather than just mains gas, which have some very different needs and considerations. And because it was quite relevant to the question of whether new homes that are built connect to gas, we considered specifically the case of new homes that are being built, say, in new estates or infill developments. We considered the climate impacts, and these are complex in two ways. In relation to space heating, they influence not only the amount of heat that you need to get out of your appliance, they influence how your appliance performs, because things that use heat pumps, such as reverse cycle air conditioners and heat pump hot water systems, they actually don't perform as well in cooler weather. They perform a lot better in warmer weather, and they can experience some challenges when it gets really cold and frosty. So we considered that as well, in terms of especially the locational consideration. Now we considered both future gas and electric price scenarios. I'll come back to that. As I mentioned earlier, we considered new homes. Now we considered two main cases for homes. One was a new home or a home that's not connected to gas, considering whether to connect to gas or not. The other one was an existing home that is connected to gas, should they be moving away from gas. Very different conclusions in relation to each. In terms of the system costs, we spent a lot of time trying to come up with a robust common measure that we could use to compare apples and apples, which are the different appliances. Different appliances have got different asset lives, different consumers have got different expectations about return on investment for what is a healthy or a positive return on investment for one consumer might not be the same as for another. In the end, we considered as our boundary case for the asset life of the things that we were looking at, we considered the lifespan over 10 years. And one reason for that is that any appliance that's reasonable quality that you install, of any persuasion, is going to last you at least 10 years. Therefore, we didn't need to compare the different asset life performances that we might get from one space heater that lasts for 20 compared to another that might only last for 12. Also, very few households make economic decisions regarding the payback of the investment payback for an investment they make based on a horizon of more than 10 years. Some do, and it's certainly not something that we would suggest is a bad way to go about it. But most households do, and as I said before, we want to make it a robust analysis that applies broadly to all consumers, not just consumers with environmental goals. We considered the age of existing appliances, and this is particularly relevant for a lot of reasons, one of which was when we consider replacing an existing appliance, if it's old and due for replacement, then you treat the economics differently to if it's working perfectly well and is going to potentially serve you for another 10 years. Because replacing an old appliance with a new appliance before it fails helps you still avoid the capex replacement of replacing it when it does fail. So that yielded very different results in terms of economics. And look, there was a long list of other considerations that we made. The national energy market. Now this is the thing that I spend all my days living and breathing, and gee, it's fun. We've got nothing that looks anything like consistency across many elements of the national energy market. And gas pricing and electricity pricing certainly continue in that tradition of inconsistency. There are lots of different gas pricing zones and lots of different electricity pricing zones. In some states, you've got the same electricity price across a whole state. In others, like Victoria, you've got 5 different distribution networks with 5 different distribution zones for electricity. That's the simple side of the equation. Gas is a lot more what we call nodal. Gas zones, gas pricing can be very, very different in between suburbs that are quite close to each other. And in Victoria, we've got about, I think, 17 different pricing zones. In New South Wales, there are at least 12. I think there's a couple in ACT. There's 4 in South Australia. There's 2 or 3 in Queensland. So we chose all the different pricing zones that we needed to have a representative sample, so that any household in all of the national energy market could say, all right, well, this is the the box that I look at in the results of the report, and that's the bit that applies to me. That was really important because we're looking at every different location and the results are very different from one location to another. You can't generalise even on a state-by-state basis, especially in Victoria and New South Wales. The other thing we considered were the different gas forecasts. So you saw before that the spaghetti that is the gas forecast is really all over the place. It's quite difficult to draw a single conclusion there. So what we did was actually looked at the forecasts that were out there. We dismissed some that we thought were bollocks because they just seemed to be based on information that was either outdated or maybe not in keeping with how we were reading some of the things that were developing in the energy market. We ended up choosing a mid-range forecast, but doing sensitivity analysis for high and low cases for each different state. We also found the forecast for price for each state varied from one state to the next. So we did different forecast ranges for each state as well. We're still a bit frustrated with the forecasts that are out there because a lot of them are by industry and they're either over-optimistic or maybe they're by energy market institutions and overly conservative in some ways. So we've started doing our own forecasts now, which I'll be able to refer to a bit later. Now, electricity prices. So they're quite interesting as well. They also differ state to state. We didn't do a more... Well, state to state's detailed enough for looking at where electricity prices are going to go. We basically took some of the information provided by the AEMC in some forecasts that they did from December. I should point out that forecasting is... I shouldn't say a waste of time because it's really important to do. But if you place a lot of faith in any of the energy market forecasts that were produced in the last few years, then you really are a gambling person and should seek help from one of those gambling helplines. They've been extremely unreliable, and that's no one's fault. It's because we've got a really unpredictable energy market at the moment. There's a lot of things that you're doing forecasting where you need data that you look back on to try and project the future, and a lot of those things have changed. So I certainly wouldn't criticise anyone for getting forecasts wrong. Doesn't make our job any easier though, because we need to find something to rely on. Now, you'll see this forecast is reasonably conservative after 2015. We're not expecting a huge price change with the exception of Queensland. Even that is not huge when you look at the scale that we're looking at here. The big dip there is because we started our forecast before our government, in its infinite wisdom, repealed the carbon tax. And so we just adjusted for that in the year 2014-15 for electricity prices. Because, of course, we're all rich now from having such low electricity bills now that the carbon price has been repealed. So, any questions about how we did the analysis before I move on to what our findings were? Yep.
Sorry, can I just ask you about that previous graph? What's on the vertical axis? What are those figures?
So that's what we're looking at there is forecast changes in electricity prices over the next few years. So along here, we're looking at time, 2015 through to 2020. And that number is just an index. Prices indexed against the price in the year 2014. So it's how prices are expected to change. Now look, and it's an interesting case. So we're talking about volume-based price here. Now, one of the major reforms that's occurring in the energy market is a change in distribution pricing. The distribution pricing, which comprises in many parts of Australia over half of your bill, in Victoria it's usually about a quarter to a third, is charged currently on a volumetric basis. Now, that's not cost reflective because the costs are actually incurred in more of a fixed way, or a way that relates to peak demand, when peak demand is used. So there's actually a change afoot. In the next few years we'll see the distribution component of our energy prices change. And there'll be more charges will be either fixed or hopefully based on peak. I say hopefully based on peak consumption because if they're based on fixed consumption, nothing you can do is actually going to reduce that component of your bill. At least if they're based on peak charges, then reducing your peak demand and alleviating the strain placed on the network can help to reduce the actual cost of your bill as well. Now, what all that means is that the volumetric charge for energy is likely to decline. So even if these forecasts are a bit conservative about the overall price, and the overall price might go higher because electricity prices just seem never to go down, it is countered by the fact that electricity prices might actually go down quite a lot for some consumers because the volumetric price is going to decrease a lot. I realise that's a bit of a complicated thing to consider on a Monday night, and if there's any questions about that that can't be held over until later, feel free to pipe up, but I'll press on. So, main finding, and this won't come as a big surprise to anyone, but because, well, it might come as a surprise to some, because of the way heat pumps work in particular, where they draw a lot of the energy that they use from the atmosphere for heating water and heating space, all electric households that use efficient appliances just use a lot less energy overall. We also found that in our base case for some of our homes, where we use a base case of ducted heating, so in Victoria there's about 1 in 4 Victorian homes have got gas ducted heating, thereabouts. Other states aren't quite so enamoured with it. It tends to be clustered in colder climates where they are. But Victoria and ACT are the main places with ducted heating. So if you take this Victorian home, you'll see that there's a massive decrease in the amount of energy used when you go from gas to efficient electric. And the main culprits for that are in relation to water heating. We're going from a gas system there that's maybe 75 or 80% efficient at best to a heat pump based system that's maybe 200 or 300% efficient because it's actually taking energy out of the atmosphere to use to heat. Now, a lot of people who aren't that familiar with appliances of that nature, when they hear something described as anything over 100%, they think it sounds like nonsense. But it's not rocket surgery, it's just how those how those appliances work. Same for space heating as for water heating. The other factor there is that you lose a lot of energy through the ducts when you have ducted heating, and you also lose a lot of energy because of a lack of ability to zone, especially in older ducted heating systems. So that factors into those findings as well. Obviously, we also had to normalise, I don't know if that's the word, I'm not a statistician, luckily for me. We also had to use a common measure, so we converted megajoules for gas into kilowatt hours for electricity there, so we can compare numbers with other numbers. The simplest findings, and these ones we found very early on in our research, because this is very easy analysis to do. When you're comparing the options for a new home, whether to go gas or electric, all you need to do is do some quite simple modelling that considers one appliance choice with another. There's no avoided capex consideration that you need to take into account, no age of existing appliances, because there are no existing appliances. So it was a very easy analysis to do, one that we did on every location and with a lot of rigour. And the conclusion that we drew, which I'm very confident is correct, is that it's actually not cost effective for any new home in Australia ever now, from this point forward, or from some point a few months ago or years ago, whenever it was, to install any gas appliances when it is built. So that's an absolute finding. A lot of the other findings we got vary from location to location, or appliance type to another, or home type to home type. This one doesn't. There is no case that's a financial case for installing gas in a new home in Australia. If you compare doing that with investing the same money that you would spend on gas appliances and gas reticulation, if you compare it with just investing that in efficient electric appliances instead, you'll be better off with the efficient electric appliances. Yep.
What percentage of homes are being done all electric at the moment, new homes?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer for that. What I imagine is that in some areas where there's housing estates, or in more areas where there's housing estates, it's still more common to roll out gas. It's still seen as a value add. For some urban infill developments, it's more likely that if they don't have gas running down the street and they're doing a rebuild and they're cognizant of the fact that gas isn't necessarily such a good idea, maybe in some of those sites you get less. It's interesting, the further north you go in Australia, the less you get gas because of, well, actually not just the further north, but the further north and the less inland you go. Tend to be cooler areas where gas is favoured a lot more, because traditionally it's seen as a cheap way to heat. So, yeah, it'll be a good question to be able to answer. I wish I had the answer for it. Tim?
Craig, this is a very important absolute finding. How long do you think you'll have to be reporting this finding out into the public until everybody hears it.
Probably until the end of that forecast period, 2023, because the conventional wisdom that gas is cheaper has kind of prevailed for a long time, and it's entrenched. And quite reasonably, people aren't going to get it for a long time. Most people don't have enough energy literacy to... Sorry, I shouldn't say that in a way that sounds insulting. In my experience as a consumer advocate, working very closely with consumers, policymakers, disadvantaged consumers as well, the majority of people don't know how to shop around for the best retail deal for them, to simply compare one electricity retailer with another electricity retailer. How the hell we can expect people to understand the nuances of whether they should choose or move away from or to one fuel type or another, when there's still a lot of advertising around there that tells them that gas is better, and the voice at the moment of people who is telling people that gas isn't a better option is confined to the BZEs and ATAs of the world. It's going to be a long battle. So I expect it's going to take a while. I should clarify, and I'll come to your question in a sec. There is actually an exception. I was a bit cheeky here. I didn't put in the exception. There is a case where... Well, actually, there's something I should clarify here. Now, I've noted here, this is when efficient electric appliances are an option. And the key element there is the word efficient. The efficient electric appliances are things like split system air conditioners, electric induction cooktops, and heat pump hot water services. Not all homes can install those yet, particularly apartments where they might not be able to have an external compressor. Therefore, they might not be able to put in a split system or a heat pump hot water service. A lot of those cases, gas is still going to be the cheaper option. So that's why the word efficient electric is in there, and that's important to get. So there are still sites where consumers are going to be better off connecting gas. They will include potentially high-density dwellings and apartments and so on. New build high-density apartments where installing split systems might not be an option. There's a question up the front.
I'm not sure whether you've got to number 2 yet, but I'm puzzled about the reference to subsidising new appliances. Who subsidises?
So the gas distribution businesses are very upset by the idea that their networks might not continue to expand as consumers continue to flock in droves to connect to the gas network. So as a commercial decision, the gas network businesses actually subsidise people connecting to the gas network. Now historically that translates to they will tend to provide no upfront charge for connecting the meter to the wall, for example. Might even do some reticulation within the house or give people discounted appliances. In Victoria, we've got this god-awful $100 million program to subsidise gas networks being built, and I shouldn't say it's god-awful, but it is. I mean, it's a waste of money. To subsidise gas networks being rolled out into regional areas, and that is a very expensive way of providing new gas connections. It's taxpayers' money going to subsidising what these businesses are doing, and what they can do is they can actually use some of that to offset the cost of consumers buying gas appliances up front. Now, if as a consumer you're choosing between spending, say, $8,000 of your own money on electric efficient appliances or $2,000 of your own money on gas appliances when someone else is coughing up another $5,000 for your gas appliances, you're probably much better off financially going with the gas appliances. So there's a subsidy there that is there. Now we put that in fairness to those businesses that are subsidising gas for those consumers because they're making a valid commercial decision to do so, regardless of what the policy frameworks are around them. And for some disadvantaged consumers in particular, that could be a really good thing if it helps them to manage their energy costs. Yep.
Just on the last slide, do you mind just...
Sure.
Thank you. I tend to think it's probably best to reflect that in kilograms of CO2, so you get an equal... I think it's a better representation overall. I mean, that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
No, but it's the last thing you want to do.
Well, but hang on, that's really what this is all about.
Oh, absolutely, but you can't talk politicians there.
And the other
Or anyone else. It's all about the money.
Well, yeah, this isn't... So that's a really good question that you raise. And this is something that we've had to counter all along and we've taken on the chin. We've been really clear this is an economic analysis all the way along. And the reason for that is there's a big gap in the economic analysis of this stuff. And we primarily, first and foremost, we exist as a consumer organisation. So we want to give people independent information to help them make the decisions that they want to make. Now, I joked before about we would have buried the report if it didn't give us the results that we wanted. The truth is that if this report told us something that was the other way around, if it told us that gas was a cheaper option, then we would be telling people, hey, here's this report is here. We wouldn't be out there parroting it so much, not because we're trying to hide the information, but because we wouldn't need to, because that's the conventional wisdom, is that gas is cheaper anyway. That'd be like if we told people, hey, the sky's blue, let's go and have a campaign to inform people that the sky's blue. The fact is, we've learned that, you know, from at least in relation to gas, this is the price. So you raise a really good question, and it's a question that relates to the environmental impacts. This report isn't looking at the environmental impacts at all. Someone, chap called Nicholas Carrazzo, I'll come to later, has actually taken the analysis that we've done here and done an impact and assessed that in terms of CO2 emissions, which is another complicated bit of work because CO2 emissions vary from state to state for electricity and a bit for gas. So in doing that, he's answered your question.
Okay. Now, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
There's no reference to renewables in this analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose it's probably something to consider, or maybe it's outside of the scope, but you know, I think once you're putting in gas infrastructure, you're really tying that building up to having gas appliances and so on for the life of that building. Whereas, you know, if you have all electric, you then can tap into the renewables market.
How would you think, how should we do that in an economic sense? Because it's an economic analysis.
Possibly looking, well, from a consumer's perspective, looking at the future cost of renewables and looking at operating costs for that building.
Okay.
If you get into a situation whereby there's more and more people moving on to a renewable grid, you get the death spiral in the conventional kind of coal-fired economy kind of thing like that. You could actually go and say, and in fact a lot of self-funded retirees are actually putting in PVs on the basis that they want to have some certainty over their income long term. So I think it's legitimate. You could say at the moment it is more expensive to go and put in PVs and get your power that way than by using conventional power. So that would be a negative. But if you take into where things are potentially heading to in terms of higher fuel costs and or getting more stability, I think you could put it in that way.
Mm-hmm. So I think the point that you make is good, that there's the opportunity that a lot of people will have to invest in solar, which might be a cheaper form of energy than that one that we've looked at there. So what we've looked at there, that's energy from the grid. But there's a few things that we considered that maybe that's a good thing, that'd be something that's useful for another bit of work. Firstly, again, we want this to be something that we can take to policymakers to apply to all sorts of people, not just people who are going to invest in solar. We don't want it to be a precondition of the findings of our report that someone sticks solar on their roof, because that's something that a policymaker who's not interested in solar could easily dismiss. It's also something a policymaker who is interested in solar could dismiss by saying, but that only applies to today 20% of people, or whatever it is. The other thing is, in the interest of being conservative, every time we get a finding that says gas is the better option using these figures, that just someone using solar and getting cheaper energy only reinforces that finding. It doesn't make much of a difference the other way. So what we've done here is come up with a conservative finding we can point to, and we can then say to the policymaker, well, we've found this finding, and for people who install solar and save a few dollars a year, it might even be better still. Another reason that we decided not to install solar, go with solar for this specifically, and in fairness, I mean, it doesn't say this, but the number is really a blended number. It's average energy prices across states. So you would argue that there's a lot of ups and downs and ins and outs in there, and you could argue that there's some solar consideration for the cost of energy regardless of how people get it. But the other thing is, when you look at the heating needs and the peak load heating needs for particularly the places that use gas the most, they don't coincide with when there's a lot of solar availability. So you don't actually get such good economic returns from specifically changing a home to PV and having non-gas heating for your electric unless you're somehow controlling or storing it, and the cost of control and storage gear adds to that. So from the very, very back of the envelope calculation that we did, what we found is that solar doesn't actually change these economics very much at all. The other thing that we found, and this did surprise us a bit more, is that the outcomes actually weren't really that sensitive to the future price trajectories. They were much more sensitive to other factors, which we'll get onto. And that did surprise us. And I guess it's a feature of the difference of things like upfront cost and discount rates and a whole lot of other things. So thanks for raising it, because it is a good point, and it is one that we thought about. And the conclusion that we've drawn is that it doesn't, the fact that people can save more money by putting in solar, our findings and the way we've done the report don't actually detract from that. But it would be a good future bit of work to do. In relation to the potential off-grid, mini-grid option, that's probably a good bit of analysis for a few years hence, when the market matures a bit more and more people are doing it, and then we can say it's a mainstream option for people today when we release that report. So yeah, when something is heavily subsidised, that usually makes it cheaper, and so there'll be some cases where customers who, even if they can install efficient electric appliances, will be economically better off, I stress, just economically, installing gas. Now, the much, much more complicated case of existing dual fuel homes. So these are homes that are built today, they've got gas appliances, anywhere between 1 and 3. In Victoria, we assume they generally tend to have 3, about something like, I don't remember what the number is, something like 80% of homes in Victoria that have gas have got 3 appliances on gas. In places like Brisbane, where it's much warmer, most homes that are on gas tend to only have 1 appliance on gas. So it's very different where you are, depending on a whole lot of conditions. What we found is that there are a whole lot of different factors that, and so what we're talking about here is not whether a consumer chooses between gas and electric for just a new appliance, it's whether they are also considering, well, I've got this existing appliance, it might be old, might be working perfectly well, it's a gas appliance, will I be better off changing it with electric? What we found is that the age or condition has a big impact. If something's due to be replaced in the next 5 years, anyway, we assume that if you replace that, you're replacing something that's due for replacement. Therefore, the real upfront cost is only the difference between what you're spending now and what you would have been spending replacing that in a couple of years' time. Whereas if you've got something that works perfectly well, and it's maybe got another 10 years in it, you have to assume that in replacing that, then you're not avoiding any capital cost. So you treat the whole upfront cost of replacing it as part of the long-term cost. One thing that we found was whether a replacement actually allows you to disconnect from the grid. So this is interesting, disconnect from the gas grid. If you're in Queensland, chances are, and you're a gas customer, chances are you've just got gas hot water or gas cooking. Now, if you replace that particular appliance with electric, you not only avoid the cost of gas that you were using, but you also avoid a fixed charge every year of $200 or $300. And across the whole country, that's the case. If you replace all your appliances that are on gas, you're also avoiding an additional charge. We found, particularly in some warmer climates, that can be enough alone to warrant replacing a perfectly good or perfectly functional gas appliance today, not even waiting for it to fail. Whether, as I mentioned before, whether a household is actually able to install the efficient electric appliances makes a difference. So if you're not able to put in a split system air conditioner and you do need heating, then you need to install a much less efficient electric option, and it's probably cheaper to stick to gas in that case. Where the existing gas supply is mains or bottled gas just tends to be a lot more expensive. Interestingly though, if you're a bottled gas user and you're only using a very small amount, for example for cooking, then your fixed costs are a lot lower than if you're connected to the mains gas network and you're spending $200 or $300 a year on that fixed cost. So it's a really complicated analysis, and that's why we separated out the LPG and the mains gas. The marginal cost of gas on a declining block tariff. So one of the biggest complications that we faced in this analysis was the tariff pricing structures for gas, also for electricity, but mainly for gas. The more gas you use, the cheaper it gets per unit in most areas. However, it varies. It's not consistent from one area to another. It's not consistent from one retailer to another. Certainly not consistent from one distributor to another. Even within one distribution network, it varies. So what that means is that the first gas appliance, if you replace, let's say you're a high gas user, and you replace your electric split system, you replace your gas space heater with an electric split system, then you actually make less of a saving than if you're a low gas user making the same switch. Because the unit cost, or the marginal cost of the energy for the lower gas user is actually higher. The reason for this is the more gas you use, the less you pay per unit.
I'm talking about gas companies potentially subsidising appliances. Are there any electricity companies subsidising electrical appliances so that they get the business that's currently going to the gas?
I think in the past that might have happened with off-peak hot water, when off-peak electric hot water has been a competitor to gas, but I'm not sure. I think it might have been back when we had vertically integrated, and state-owned assets in Victoria, for example, that was done with electric hot water. And you would argue that the provision of electric hot water in the off-peak at a really cheap rate, which is actually in some cases below the rate that it cost to produce it, the rate in itself was a subsidy, even if the appliance wasn't subsidised. Another thing, as I mentioned before, is climate. So again, as I said, not just because of the heating demand required in colder climates, but of course how appliances perform as well. And finally, the ratio of gas to electricity price. This proved to be one of the biggest single determinants. Some areas have got expensive gas and cheap electricity. Some areas have got expensive electricity and cheap gas. Victoria has particularly cheap gas, but it's also got cheap electricity. So the ratios are really important. And to compare apples with apples, we found that you had to look at that. I'll bring up a graph at some stage that shows that particular result. Actually, I'll just check that I have it. Don't have that graph here, unfortunately. If you look at the report, you'll find it. So, in terms of the findings for those dual fuel homes, now it's hard to summarise because they are so locationally dependent and a whole lot of other things. But here are some generalised ones. It's very cost effective to replace gas heaters with multiple reverse cycle air conditioners. So if you've got gas heaters for space heating, ducted heaters, wall units, you don't even have to wait for them to fail. If you replace them, you'll get paybacks. In some cases, the paybacks are within a couple of years because of the difference in the amount of energy used. Switching multiple gas appliances to electric is already cost effective in some locations. It's a very small number of locations where even if nothing needs to be replaced, if you went out and replaced it all today, all your gas appliances at a house where you've got 2 or 3, then you'll be better off. That's really only warmer climates though. It's not in Victoria. Queensland, Brisbane is actually a place that's got not only high fixed prices for gas, but high volumetric prices. And what did I say before about people using gas in Brisbane?
It's for 1 or 2 things.
It's only for 1 or 2 things. So for them, it's a no-brainer. Like we could hardly find a case for someone to keep a gas appliance in Brisbane when we look at the results. In Victoria, gas is really, really cheap. So, and the climate means that we've got a higher demand for it. So for a lot of people, for a lot of different appliances, putting aside the first one, which is the split system air conditioners to replace other types of heaters, in a lot of Victoria, consumers are still better off economically staying on gas.
Does that normal one include if you've got hydronic heating?
No, that's multiple reverse cycle air conditioners. Oh, so you mean gas hydronic heating?
Yeah.
Now that's a really good question. I'm going to have to rack my brains on that one. And this is the problem when you go on holiday for 5 weeks and you've carried the details of one of the many detailed projects that you're working on all year, and then you have a holiday to purge everything that seems work-related out of your brain. I could have answered that about 7 weeks ago. In our report, we've done a very detailed thing in the appendices. We tried to make it user-friendly and put all the discussion stuff that you guys would really like in the appendices. We've discussed the treatment of hydronic and other types of heating. Now, generally speaking, I think you'll be better off if you've got hydronic, keeping hydronic. One reason that we didn't do a comparison between gas hydronic and multiple reverse cycle air conditioners is that we didn't think that they were like with like. So people choose hydronic heating because it's a very comfortable type of heating. They usually don't choose it for economic reasons. They've got a high sunk cost in investing in it. If you're in a new build, there is no way that hydronic heating could be a better option economically because it costs a lot up front. But if you've already got hydronic heating, then chances are you don't want to replace it with reverse cycle air conditioners because you've got a really nice quality of heat there, which you probably won't want to sacrifice. There's hands up from people who are about to ask me, what about heat pump hot water systems to provide hydronic heating? Was that spot on? Yeah? Okay, cool. Now, when we looked at that, we found that that might be an option. It's not one that we pressingly need to analyse, though. And the reason is this. Firstly, it's economically, you'll be better off with gas rather than heat pump hot water systems for hydronic heating if you've got existing gas. And the reason for this is, if you look at the annualised performance of a heat pump hot water service for providing hot water, it's working in winter and in summer, and it's efficient on that basis. However, if you're using it to provide your space heating, it's going to be doing its hardest work when it's cold outside, and that's when it's not so efficient. So based on the numbers that we already had, we did back of the envelope calculation that showed that economically you're much better off if you've got an existing gas hydronic system, sticking with that rather than connecting to RCAC. We also found, as I said, that quality reasons, people are unlikely to change. However, if you're looking at economics and you're installing a new one in a new home, then hydronic is the most expensive option of pretty much anything. So, but it's not economics that drives people to install hydronic. Yep.
One argument you haven't made at the moment, I'm just wondering why, there's a lot of people who have dual fuel homes with reverse cycle air conditioning units and they have gas heating because they want to be cool in the summer.
Yep.
And, I think that's the kind of...
So we've addressed that in a rather sophisticated way. If you have a look at our report, you'll see what we've done is for each location, we've attributed the capital expenditure on an RCAC based on whether it'll be primarily used for heating, cooling, or both. In somewhere like Brisbane, we assumed that if you purchase a reverse cycle air conditioner, then you're not purchasing it for the purpose of space heating. You're purchasing it for cooling. Therefore, we attribute more of the capital cost of that to the space cooling requirement, and we attribute the relevant cost, which is just the operational cost, to heating, and compare that with doing that with gas. A gas space heater can't perform a cooling function, so it would be inappropriate for us to do the similar thing with gas space heater. In Victoria, we assumed that if you're installing... Now, even though a lot of people would in Victoria install an RCAC just for cooling purposes, we assumed that when you use that system for all of your cooling and heating, you're actually going to be using about 30, 40, 50 times as much energy to heat as you are to cool, because that's the nature of the Victorian climate in a typical house. In a highly efficient house, it wouldn't be the case, but not everyone lives in a highly efficient house, and that's another feature of our analysis. So we did consider that. What I think is it was an analysis that we treated through, rather than do a whole lot of extra sensitivities, we built that into our assumptions around the capital expenditure. The case that I think is more interesting that we didn't consider is, because we never assume that consumers are completely rational, because if you do that, then you end up with an analysis that will get thrown out on the basis that it doesn't apply to half of consumers, or at least half. The thing that, if you look at what we found that we didn't really report on because it was through complicated late night iterations of playing with the model, the most cost-effective way of doing a conversion for a lot of homes that are staying on gas anyway would be to keep their gas ducted system and just stick in 1 or 2 split system air conditioners that would meet all of their heating loads for most of the time, and only use that gas ducted system for those few days when they really need an extra heating boost. So for homes that have got an existing gas ducted system, who are staying on gas for other reasons, such as cooking or whatever, those are the more efficient configuration is not one that we've measured here. It's actually a combination of those. But that's a very specific thing. Yep, one more question, then I'll press on.
Yeah, it just seems to me you might be sort of ignoring what I think must be a very common scenario, chance, where I live, where you actually have a choice in winter of either switching the electric air conditioner on in reverse cycle, or going and flicking the switch and switching, which is the more efficient. I mean, I used to rely totally on the gas, but the electric seems to be a...
Yep. If you've got a relatively high efficiency split system, now we didn't choose the highest efficiency split system because, again, it's got to be relevant to most consumers. A lot of consumers in rural areas don't have the options to access a high efficiency split system. Consumers who shop at Harvey Norman's, and a lot do, won't have the highest efficiency split system. Consumers who don't live next door to a Dakin store might be unaware that there's a super high efficiency split system. We also found that the highest efficiency ones don't give you the best return for investment. So in the case of, in your question, whether it's more efficient to do one or another really depends on the efficiency of the split system and the efficiency of the gas system. And we have actually covered that scenario by doing sensitivity analysis in the report. So I mentioned that we've done different treatment of attribution of the capital cost. We've done sensitivity analysis that shows in somewhere like, now I can't remember in Victoria if we did 50% or 0% for our sensitivity, but there was one case where we attributed only 50% or 0% of the capital cost of a system to the heating, to the cooling requirement. And that's the case that you're talking about, where all you're doing is switching it on and considering the marginal cost. So we have considered that in the depths of the bowels of the report. Yep. I'll press on. So switching from gas to induction cooktops and electrics is cost effective when avoiding high fixed charges. So I mentioned before that there's a whole lot of different charges. Some are high, some are low for fixed charges. They vary across the country. In the areas that have got the highest fixed charges, if it's the only appliance that you've got, then you're better off actually just ditching your gas cooktop and replacing it with efficient electric. That's actually a relatively small case, though, in terms of the numbers of consumers. Most consumers who have gas aren't in that particular position. That would be mainly a few consumers in Brisbane and maybe some parts of northern New South Wales that are in that case. We also found, this is a case in Victoria, so I mentioned before that we've got this program that subsidises gas being rolled out to consumers. Even though there's a massive subsidy involved with that, it doesn't cover all the cost of installing the new gas pipelines. So consumers in areas like Warburton, along the Murray region, where there's new gas networks being rolled out to existing towns, end up actually paying more for gas than other consumers. Therefore, there's a lot of consumers we found who have probably just installed gas appliances in the last year. They're going to have more of a stronger case to ditch those gas appliances today than a lot of other consumers, which is a really awful outcome because it means that those consumers have made an investment thinking that they're going to save money, and it's ended up not being the case.
And we pay for it as well.
And we pay for it. We pay for it, they pay for it. I don't think there's any winners aside from maybe a few businesses.
The pipes are sunk assets.
Well, that gets into a very complicated space. Yes, they are a sunk asset insofar as they're sunk in the ground and you can't remove them. But you keep on paying for them through WACS and DORCs and a whole lot of other acronyms that I won't bore you with because they're all energy marketing. Unfortunately, I do need to press on. So hopefully there'll be a bit of time left over once I finish rabbiting on, but I don't have a lot longer to go. I'll just wrap up with the recommendations that we made. I've got a few bonus slides that talk about how we treated space heating, because for two reasons. One, it's a question that keeps coming up because explaining to people how you can substitute a centralised space heating unit with a whole bunch of non-centralised ones requires a bit of explanation. And I've got some slides for that. Also, that was an area where the work of BZE was really helpful for us, so I thought I'd show you how we've used that. If we've got time, we'll get on to that. From the perspective of our advocacy, the recommendations here are really important, so I'll just rush through these. Our first recommendation was that energy concessions should be changed to address cost of living impact on vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. So there's a whole lot of consumers there who don't enjoy the luxury of having the money to be able to change appliances because their gas prices have gone up. For a whole lot of people who do have access to capital, their gas bills are going to be able to go up, they can do something about it. For the most disadvantaged consumers in our society, that's not an option. The energy concessions frameworks that exist at the moment, especially outside of Victoria, don't cater to the needs of those consumers well enough. So that's our first recommendation, to change the energy concessions frameworks. Also, there's this really dirty word called reservation. Has anyone heard that in relation to gas?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the idea that you have a fixed price or a reserve price for a certain portion of gas for a certain number of consumers. Everyone who uses gas wants a reservation. Low-income consumers want one for low-income consumers, or residential for residential. But the big businesses are actually going to feel more of a pinch from gas prices going up because it's a bigger component. The wholesale cost is a bigger component of their bills, so they're crying out for reservations as well. We're not asking for a reservation because it's very politically unsavoury policy. What we are asking for is that there are something like a social tariff put in place so that those disadvantaged consumers who are accessing gas today aren't further disadvantaged by high price spikes. It's an alternative, if you like, to the concessions, but we're taking a bit of a scattergun approach there and hoping that both of those things will be granted. It'd be better if it wasn't even a problem that we had to solve. So it would be good if option 3 was taken up as well, which is that consumers are better informed. Now, there might be a role for governments in this, there might be a role for organisations like ourselves there is clearly a role for organisations like ATA and BZE to keep informing consumers about what their best options are. There's a lot of detail in our report, as you'll see, and we're looking to try and turn that into some good fact sheets that actually help people make the right decisions for them. Because putting aside the environmental stuff, there are a whole lot of people who, for economic reasons, if that's all that's of interest in them, will be better off staying on gas, or better off keeping specific appliances on gas. We don't want to present information that's going to be broadly discredited, so we want to give accurate information for all consumers about whether they should stay on gas or go electric. There's other scope for that. I mean, in relation to appliance standards and labelling, at the moment, some of the standards and the labelling are really, really good for helping consumers compare one electric appliance with another electric, or one gas appliance with another gas, but none of them are actually set up to help people compare gas and electric. That's a really complicated one that I'm working with some people in that particular department on trying to do something about. Now, there are still lots of advertisements around that say that gas is cheap and efficient and better for the environment and all that rubbish, which is now rubbish. We think there's a job for the ACCC and the Australian Energy Regulator to do something about that. Hence, we recommend that there's more regulatory oversight on that one. We had this report very extensively peer reviewed, and I'm very grateful to the feedback that we've had from a couple of the gas businesses who actually took the time to work with us on some of the assumptions that went into our report. They gave us feedback on what they thought about the recommendations that we made. I won't name them because their feedback was provided anonymously, although you could work it out by working out who we thank in our report. And their feedback was extremely useful. And one of them actually said that they couldn't fault our recommendations. The only thing that they disagreed with was strengthening the regulatory oversight of marketing as gas as cheaper and more efficient than electricity. And as I say, I do stress that their feedback was actually really useful and valuable, and very supporting of them to cooperate with us in this report, which is obviously something that tells them things they don't want to hear. So I think they deserve credit for that. We also suggested, they didn't like this one really either, that a different one didn't like this one, there's one Victorian one, an urgent review of policy and programs that subsidise and support the expansion of gas networks. So this is hilarious. Around the time we produced this report, which pretty heavily criticised the $100 million program that Victoria has to roll out gas to regional areas, a report was released in New South Wales by, who was the body there, Tim, that did that? It was a...
Regional Development Council or something?
Yeah, something like that. that basically said, hey, they've got this great program in Victoria. I think we should do that here as well. So we suggested that all that stuff should be reviewed. We think that those policies should be replaced with programs that directly address energy affordability. Now, one of the changes that was made between the version of this report that went out for review and the latest version was that in the interest of removing emotive language, I changed that word from actually to directly, because there's nothing in the existing programs that actually addresses energy affordability. Except for those limited number of consumers in regional areas who live in high-rise apartments who can't put in efficient systems. We also thought that, now this is a complicated one, so I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but businesses benefit from having a case. Regulated electricity and gas businesses benefit from being able to demonstrate to the regulator that their services are really needed increasingly over the next few years, so they can build more poles, wires, pipes, whatever it is. And we figured that both in electricity and with gas, there are death spirals imminent, yet the forecasts that these businesses are using demonstrate that there is no reduction in demand for their service. So we thought that there should be changes to the national energy rules, require them to actually forecast their competitive position against other sources. That means gas actually looking at its competitive position against electricity on a customer-to-customer basis for those purposes, and also electricity looking at its electricity networks, looking at their competitive position against standalone power systems.
Did you say on a customer-to-customer basis?
It doesn't mean that they go to each customer and look at that. It means that they look at it from a customer class basis. So they'll say this class of customers might be better off with this type of appliance in this case. So yes, I did say that, but I didn't mean they poll each individual household. Finally, or not finally, so there's this funny thing in Victoria that's not that funny. DHS has policies around public housing that preclude the installation of reverse cycle air conditioners, partly for equity reasons, except for where a consumer needs them for cooling reasons, because they might have a thermoregulatory illness or something, another health reason. They also have a policy of, if gas runs down the street, we will connect it to the home and put in gas appliances. Now, these consumers who live in those homes are among the most disadvantaged in Victoria. They're the ones who can least afford to pay rising gas bills that are about to steeply increase, yet they're being given no option to avoid that by these policies. So, to the credit of DHS, they're happy to talk to us and work with us to see what they can do about that. It's a good discussion that we're having. I should say in relation to all these recommendations, we're getting really good traction with the relevant bodies, and I put that down to the fact that we've done a robust analysis that doesn't look like hippie environmental stuff. I love hippie environmental stuff, but you know, this is where we're going with it.
Another 10 minutes, great.
Okay, that's great. We also thought that we should provide, or support should be provided to, we agonised over this one, whether landlords really should be financially supported, but we left it at support, might not be financial. But also people, seniors, people who are disadvantaged, owner-occupiers, to replace their expensive to run gas appliances with more efficient appliances. Now, we've said more efficient appliances, we haven't said with electric, because for some of those, they might be better off replacing their existing old gas heater with a 6-star gas heater. So we wouldn't want to rule that out, because they're still going to be better off, they'll still be using less gas. So those are the sort of solutions that we're looking at. What else are we doing? So this presentation I just gave out, were any of you at the Grattan Institute presentation that I spoke at late last year? No? Good. Excellent. Well, that would have been very familiar to you. So I thought for any of you who were, I threw in this one as an extra. What are we doing now? What's happening since then? So our study looked at the national energy market, which isn't really national. Don't ask why. And that's the east coast of Australia. We're expanding the analysis at the moment to include Western Australia, and there's a separate report which will be out for that at some stage soon. All the changes that we've got in our recommendations we've advocated for, so my job is to do that. I work with our other consumer advocates and with government to push for changes to the energy market around gas and a whole lot of other stuff. So we're pushing for all of those, and we're having some really good really good traction. In fact, there are none of those issues, none of those recommendations that I've made that I would say we're falling flat on with recommendations, with traction, with one exception being anything that looks like fixing retail prices like a social tariff. But even that, there's people willing to talk about it in government. We're also, so someone, that chap Nicholas Carrazzo, I haven't met personally, did some analysis which was released while I was holidaying down in Tasmania, so I haven't finished reading the final version, but it's on our website, and it answers the question of what are the emissions associated with our analysis. So everything that we've analysed the cost of, how does it work on an emissions basis? And it found that usually, 99% of the time, if you do something that's going to save you money economically, moving from gas to electricity, it also has a net emissions reduction. We're also developing our own gas demand forecast models. I guess like Tim, we got frustrated with all the forecasts that were out there, and we've got some really good forecasting aptitude and experience in our team, so we decided to do some of that. We're also working with one of our commercial clients to do some work for them on demand forecasting of gas. And like everything here, it's all subject to funding, and we're hoping to get more to do so. Developing more tools and information to help people choose between gas and electric, and I think that's going to be the ongoing work for our organisation that will be the most public-facing work out of all of this in coming years. So I think we've got a little bit of time for a few questions.
On the average demand for gas, how many years does Australia have East Coast gas?
Oh, that's a good question. Too many. More than we'll need it for, I'd say. Yeah. There's a few different gas basins. Some of them are depleted more than others. It's a very complicated equation, and I don't think anyone's got the answer to it, because it really depends on price. It depends on...
I was thinking of volumes, but how many years?
You mean in the ground? Yeah.
It depends how much you export.
It depends how much you export.
How much you export, yeah.
It depends on price. It depends what the local demand is. It depends how competitive gas remains or it doesn't with other fuel sources. It'll depend a lot on Australia's local industry. A lot of gas goes to industry, and one thing that appears to be the case to me is that the peak constraints for gas are really driven by domestic peak spikes in use during high times that require high winter heating, but the volume is really, over the course of a year, is driven more by commercial and industrial demand.
So the price goes up to 50%, and there's not a reservation for local manufacturing or local industry, then
exactly.
It's another bullet to their head for local manufacturing, and
Yep.
just offshore it or whatever.
Exactly.
So that it then plummets the volume requirement for gas.
Exactly, and that will return our 100 years of reserves into 300 years of reserves. So, it's a real... I don't know what the number is. That was just off the top of my head.
But that's about the right number.
Is it? Oh, okay. There you go. Yep.
Just wondering if enough people get out of gas, what happens to the fixed charges? They'll be carried by... I can imagine they'll be carried by the people remaining, yes?
Yep.
So if there's a rush to get out of gas, then
Yep.
be adjusted upwards or add to the cost.
Absolutely.
Substantially.
Yep. And that's why we're pushing now for those gas networks that are still being built out into areas to be curtailed, because we can't do anything about the fact that there's existing networks built that are, that are going to be, the costs are going to have to be recovered for. It's inevitable. It's inevitable that consumers will disconnect regardless of what we tell them, because eventually people are going to start to realise it's more expensive. There's no benefit to connect.
At any point does it collapse, or do you know about how that works economically?
Yeah, it's collapsed. The point where it collapses, it's less about whether there is a drop. It's more about what the drop looks like relative to forecasts. Because the way demand works in our systems, it's a bit different, but in the wholesale and transmission systems, as well as in the regulated distribution areas, a lot of what is built is based on forecasts. Volume forecast, numbers of connections forecast, and forecasts are locked in for a few years, and costs are recovered on the basis of those forecasts. So in the case of gas customers, if you've got a forecast of a slowly increasing number of gas customers, which is associated with slowly increasing volume of use, and what actually happens is it goes the other way, then it's very quick that, a very, I don't know if it's a tipping point per se, but a situation where you've got negative cost implications for someone is going to occur. And historically, consumers pay for negative cost implications. The only exception to that has been where there's, in our energy market in recent years, has been where there was an over-forecast of the need for capacity for generation in a competitive space, not a regulated space. So a whole lot of extra generation was built, and now we've got too much capacity. It's a competitive space, so energy is cheap for that as a result. I'll defer to our chair for the remaining question answering.
We can take one more question. Make it two. All right.
I'll let you choose a person.
Just an observation on another point you might want to make in terms of the advocacy thing. You brought up this issue about vulnerability of people with respect to cost and things like this. I think it's also quite a strong correlation to the unaffordability, from an energy point of view, to issues of vulnerability with respect to climate change. Because one of your comments around climate, I thought you might make it under that thing there, is that there were more people who died in their own homes from heat exhaustion on Black Saturday than actually died in the fires. And I think that's going to be, with climate change increasing, that's going to become more and more of an issue. So, actually moving towards an electric network using heat pumps, which give the ability to provide cooling to people at times when it's an extreme event, is actually tackles two social issues at the same time.
That is an argument that we're using when we speak to Department of Human Services about their homes, because they've got a policy for not even installing these things. As we see it, it's a dated policy. It's based on some assumptions that no longer hold, and you don't have to be someone who's actually certified as having a thermoregulatory illness to be impacted by a heat wave. So there'll be people who benefit from that change. So yep, that is definitely something that we're picking up on. Yep.
Did you have a really quick question with a quick answer?
Quick question. The very first gas forecast, the most ambitious graph, was a company called ASIL.
Yep.
Except the same company that headed up the review of the renewable energy data.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yep.
No vested interests.
None whatsoever. Yeah. ASIL's forecast, I mean, they've been a bit conservative because they've picked a bit of a range. They're no worse than any other, but they're certainly less creative because they've got the least bends in their line. So, they're probably being a bit more backwards looking in their forecast and looking a bit less at future events. One thing I'll say about the forecasting model that we're building, because we're pedantic and geeky, it's actually a really sophisticated model that uses an approach that all of these people and AMO and so on haven't used for demand. This is a price forecast, but our forecasts are for demand, not price. It's a building block model, so it actually looks at, well, what if consumers change their behaviour? This is the thing that forecasting models for demand that are used in the national energy market have almost never actually used. Behaviour change. I mean, who'd have thunk it? People putting solar panels on their roofs, stuff like that. So if people are actually changing their behaviour, so we've got the capacity in our models to say, okay, well, what if the word does start to get out there in the next few years and consumers stop connecting new homes? How does that relate to the forecast that's there? So one of the benefits of the model that we're building is we should be able to use it as a sanity check for those regulatory forecasts that a lot of the gas businesses are doing, and take it to the regulator and say, well, hang on, we've plugged their forecast into our model, and we've found that if only 5% of consumers who would be better off economically moving away from gas in this particular area do, then it has this very significant effect on that. So that's actually going to be a really useful tool for that regulatory space.
That's why AMO calls their forecast a statement of opportunities.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the opportunities that they're pursuing at the moment is opportunities to adopt better forecasting approaches. I should say, in defence of AMO, they've done nothing wrong. They've been, probably a bit behind the times in how long it's taken them to... So when I say they've done nothing wrong, you can't really fault a business or a body like AMO for not taking a progressive approach to something. They're always going to take a conservative, backwards-looking approach. You will be able to fault AMO if they don't do something different from this point forward. Like they've now had enough experience to realise that the approach they did take doesn't work for forecasting. If they continue to go forward without changing it, then I think they're probably doing something a bit
Well, it's suicidal. They're saying now we've got 6,000 megawatts of over capacity, which just happens to be the same as the generating capacity for all the Victorian power stations.
Yep.
I think you could forgive them perhaps for 2009. You could perhaps forgive them for 2011.
I've gone out to 2012 actually, but I'm a forgiving person. Look at it this way. I mean, if they hadn't have done that over forecasting, then I'd have less advocacy to do, because then I'd be out of a job. You know, so, yeah.
Okay, we're really going to have to call it quits there. There was a problem with booking the room tonight, and the security guard, instead of kicking us all out at 6:30, offered to come back at 8 o'clock to close up. So could we please all leave the room by 8 o'clock? That might be difficult. Would you please thank Craig? So just before you go, I've said before that BZD runs on a very, very tight budget, and some of you came in late and may have neglected to put a gold coin in the box outside, so if you do a gold coin exit, that'll be very helpful. We're always pleased to have people volunteering to contribute to BZD. BZD's funds come only from individuals, not from any business or politics. If you want to continue this discussion, Craig, are you able to go to the pub next door?
Yeah, for a bit.
Yeah? Okay, so we'll reconvene for those who want to at the pub just on the next corner. The next BZD discussion on Monday the 2nd of March, we'll have Richard Keach, who's here tonight, and James Bramwell presenting the BZD Energy Freedom Story and how households can take the practical steps that lead to disconnecting their household gas supply. Thank you very much.